Chapter 14 of Four Girls at Chautauqua. This recording is in the public domain. Four Girls at Chautauqua by Pansy. Chapter 14 The New Lesson. Eurie turned her pillow, thumped the scant feathers into little heaps, and gave a dismal groan as she laid her head back on it. "It's very queer," she said, "that as soon as ever I made up my mind to be orthodox, and go to meeting every time the bell rings, I should be dumped into a heap on this hard bed with the headache. I haven't had a touch of it before." "The way of transgressors is hard," quoted Marion, going on calmly with her writing. "If you hadn't taken that horrid tramp yesterday instead of going to meeting like a Christian, you would have been all right to day." "I believe you sit up nights to read your Bible, so as to have verses to fling at people who are overtaken in any possible trial or inconvenience. You always have them ready. Didn't you bring it with you, and don't you prepare a list for each day's use?" This was Eurie's half merry, half petulant reply to the Bible verse that had been flung at her. Marion carefully erased a word that seemed to her fastidious taste too inexpressive before she answered: "I don't own such an article as a Bible, my child, so your suspicions are entirely unfounded. My early education was not defective in that respect, however, and I confess that I find many verses that seem to very aptly describe the ways of sinful mortals like yourself." Eurie raised herself on one elbow, regardless of headache and the cloth wet in vinegar that straightway fell off. "You don't own a Bible!" she said in utter surprise, and with a touch of actual dismay in her voice. "I am depraved to that degree, my dear little saint. I conclude that you are more devoutly inclined, and have one of your own. Pray, how many chapters a day do you read in it?" Eurie lay down again, and Flossy came with the vinegar cloth and bound it securely on her forehead. "I don't read it very often, to be sure," Eurie murmured. "In fact, I suppose I may as well say that I never do. But then I own one, and always have. I am not a heathen, and really and truly it seems almost queer not to have a Bible of one's own. It is a sort of mark of civilization, you know." Marion laughed good naturedly. "I never make a great deal of pretense in that line," she said gayly. "As for being a heathen, that is only a relative term. According to Dr. Calkins, they were more or less in advance of us. I am one of the advanced sort. Ruth, your toilet ought to be nearly completed. I hear that indefatigable bell." "You are very foolish not to go this morning and let your writing wait. We shall be certain to have something worth listening to. It is a strange time to select for absence." This was Ruth's quiet answer, as she pinned her lace ruffle with a gleaming little diamond. "Diligent in business. There is another verse for you, my heathen," Marion said, with a merry glance toward Eurie. "When you get home and get the dust of years swept off from your Bible, you take a look at it, and see if I have not quoted correctly. And a good, sensible verse it is. I have found it the only way in which to keep my head above water. Ruthie, the trouble is not with me, it lies with those selfish and obstinate newspaper men. If they would have the sense to let their papers wait over another day, I could go to the lecture this morning. As it is, I am a victim to their indifference. If I miss a blessing, the sin will be at their door, not mine." Eurie opened her heavy eyes and looked at Flossy. "Come," she said, "don't stand there mopping me in vinegar any longer. Are you ready? I am really disappointed. I've always wanted to hear that man. I want to tell Nell about him." Flossy washed her hands, shook back the yellow curls with an indifferent and preoccupied air, and went to the door to wait for Ruth. She had taken no part in the war of words that had been passing between Marion and Eurie, but she had heard; and like almost everything else that she heard during these days, it had awakened a new thought and desire. Flossy was growing amazed at herself. It seemed to her that she must have spent her 17 years of life taking long naps, and this Chautauqua was a stiff breeze from the ocean that was going to shake her awake. The special thought that had dashed itself at her this morning was that she, too, had no Bible. Not that she did not own one, elegantly done in velvet and clasped in gold, so effectually clasped that it had been sealed to her all her life. She positively had no recollection of having ever sat down deliberately to read the Bible. She had "looked over" occasionally in school, but even this service of her eyes had been fitful and indifferent; and as for her head paying any sort of attention to the reading, it might as well have been done in Greek instead of French, which language she but dimly comprehended even when she tried. But now she ought to have a Bible. She ought not to wait for that velvet covered one. A whole week in which to find what some of her orders were, and no way in which to find them. Of course she could buy one, but how queer it would seem to be going to the museum to make a purchase of a Bible. "They will wonder why I did not bring my own," she murmured, with that lifelong deference that she had educated herself to pay to the "they" who composed her world. And in another instance the newborn feeling of respect and independence asserted itself. "I can't help that," she said positively, shaking her curls with a determined air. "And it really makes no difference what anybody thinks. Of course I must have a Bible, and I only wish I had it for this morning. I shall certainly get one at the first opportunity." Then she turned and said good morning to the pretty little lady who occupied the tent next door, and between whom and herself a pleasant acquaintance was springing up. "Are you going to the lecture?" Flossy asked, and the small lady shook her head with a wistful air. "Dear me, no. My young tyrant wouldn't consent to that. I meant to take him down with me and try him, but he has gone to sleep; and it is just as well, for he would have been certain to want to do all the talking. He has no idea that there is any one in the country who knows quite as much as he does." It was said in a half complaining tone, but underneath it was the foundation of tender pride, that showed her to be the vain mother of the handsome tyrant. Still it seemed to be Flossy's duty to condole with her. "You miss most of the meetings, do you not?" "Three-fourths of them. You see it is inconvenient to have a husband who is a reporter for the press, and who must be there to hear. It is only when he must write up his notes for publication that I can get a chance; and even then, unless it's baby's sleepy time, it does me no good. I am especially sorry this morning, for Dr. Cuyler used to be my pastor. He married me one summer morning just like this, and I haven't laid eyes on him since. I should like to hear his voice again, but it can't be done." Now who would have imagined that, with all the powers that were bestirring themselves to come to Flossy's education, it would have been a rosy, crowing baby, in the unconsciousness of a morning nap, that should have given her her first lesson in unselfishness? Yet he was the very one. It flashed over Flossy in an instant from some source. Who was so likely to have suggested it as the sweet angel who hovered over the sleeping darling? "Oh, Mrs. Adams, let me stay with baby, and you go to hear Cuyler. It is a real pity that you should miss him, when he is associated with your life in this way. I never saw him, and though, of course, I should like to, yet I presume there will be opportunities enough. I will be as careful of baby as if he were my grandson, and if he wakens I will charm him out of his wits, so that it will never occur to him to cry." Of course there was demurring and profuse expressions of thanks and declinatures all in a breath; but Flossy was so winning, so eager, so thoroughly in earnest; and the little Mrs. Adams did so love her old pastor, and did feel so anxious to see him again, that in a very short time she was beguiled into going in all haste to her tent to make a go-to-meeting toilet. And a blessed thing it was that that sentence does not mean at Chautauqua what it does in Buffalo, or Albany, or a few other places, else Dr. Cuyler might have slipped from them before the necessary articles were all in array. It involved simply the twitching off of a white apron, the settling of a pretty sun hat, for the sun actually shone! And the seizure of a waterproof, needed, if she found a seat, to protect her from the damp boards; needed in any case, because in 5 minutes it might rain, and she was ready. Ruth came to the door. "Come, Flossy," she said. "Where in the world are you? We shall be late," and said it precisely as though she had been waiting for that young person for half an hour. Flossy emerged from the adjoining tent. "I am not going," she said. "I have turned nurse girl, and have the sweetest little baby in here that ever grew. Mrs. Adams is going in my place. Mrs. Adams, Miss Erskine." And as those two ladies walked away together Mrs. Adams might have been heard to say: "What a lovely, unselfish disposition your friend has. It was so beautiful in her to take me so by storm this morning. I am afraid I was very selfish, which is apt to be the case, I think, when one comes in contact with actual unselfishness. It is one of the Christian graces that is very hard to cultivate, anyway. Don't you think so?" Ruth was silent, not from discourtesy, but from astonishment. It was such a strange experience to hear any one speak of Flossy Shipley as unselfish. In truth, she had grown up under influences that had combined to foster the most complete and tyrannical selfishness, exercised in a pretty winning sort of way, but rooted and grounded in her very life. So indeed was Ruth's, but she, of course, did not know that, though she had clear vision for the mote in Flossy's eyes. Meantime Marion had stayed her busy pen and was biting the end of it thoughtfully. The two tents were such near neighbors that the latter conversation and introduction had been distinctly heard. She glanced around to the girl on the bed. "Eurie," she said, "are you asleep, or are you enjoying Flossy's last new departure?" Eurie giggled. "I heard," she said. "The lazy little mouse has slipped out of a tedious hour, and has a chance to lounge and read a pleasant novel. I dare say the mother is provided with them." Then Marion, after another thoughtful pause: "But, my child, how do you account for the necessity of going to the neighbors and taking the supervision of a baby in order to do that? Flossy need not have gone to church if she didn't choose." "Yes, she did. Don't you suppose the child can see that it is the fashion of the place? She is afraid that it wouldn't look well to stay in the tent and lounge, without an excuse for doing so. If that girl could only go to a place where it was the fashion for all people to be good, she would be a saint just because they were." "She would have to go to heaven," muttered Marion, going on with her writing. "And, according to you, there is no such place, so there is no hope for her after all. Oh, dear! I wonder if you are right, and nothing is of any consequence anyhow." And the weary girl turned on her pillow and tried not to think, an effort that was hard to accomplish after a week's experience at Chautauqua. Flossy sat herself down beside the sleeping darling, and cast about her for something to amuse or interest, her eyes brightening into beauty as she recognized a worn and torn copy of the Bible. Eurie would have been surprised to see the eagerness with which she seized upon the book that was to afford her entertainment. She turned the leaves tenderly, with a new sense of possession about her. This Bible was a copy of letters that had been written to her, words spoken, many of them, by Jesus himself. Strange that she had so little idea what they were! Marion, with her boasted infidel notions, knew much more about the book than Flossy with her nominal education and belief. She had no idea where to turn or what to look for to help her. Yet she turned the leaves slowly, with a delicious sense of having found a prize. A book of instructions, a guide book for her on this journey that she was just beginning to realize that she was taking. Somewhere within it she would find light and help. The book was one that had been much used, and had a fashion of opening of itself at certain places that might have been favorites with the little mother. At one of those places Flossy halted and read: "After this there was a feast of the Jews." "After what, I wonder?" she said within herself. She knew nothing about it. "Never mind, I will see pretty soon. This is about a feast where Jesus was. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Oh, how nice to have been there, wherever that was." The ignorant little thing had not the least idea where Jerusalem was, except that it was in that far away, misty Holy Land, that had seemed as vague and indefinite to her as the grave or as heaven. But there came suddenly to her heart a certain blessed analogy. "If I were going to write an account of my recent experiences to some dear friend that I wanted to tell it to," she said, talking still to herself, or to the sleeping baby, "I would write it something like this: After this. That would mean, let me see what it would mean. Why, after that party at home, when I danced all night and was sick. After this there was a feast of the Christian people at Chautauqua, and Jesus went there. I would certainly write that, for I have seen him and heard him speak in my very heart. Then she went on, through the second verse to the third. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. And here a great swell of tears literally blinded her eyes. It came to her so suddenly, so forcibly. The great multitude here at Chautauqua, blind. Yes, some of them. Was not she? How many more might there be? Many of whom she knew, others that she did not know, but that Jesus did. Waiting without knowing that they were waiting. With tears and smiles, and with a new great happiness throbbing at her heart, she read through the sweet, simple, wonderful story, how the poor man met Jesus, how he questioned, how the man complained, and how Jesus was greater than his infirmity. Through the whole of it, until suddenly she closed the book, her tears dried, and a solemn, wondering, almost awestruck look on her face. She had got her lesson, her directions, her example. She could bear no more, even of the Bible, just then. She said it over, that startling verse that came to her with a whole volume of suggestion. And the man departed, and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. Chapter 15. Chapter 16.